I remember the first time I heard of Pentax. So, if you don't know me, my name is Noe. I'm a photographer living in Seoul, South Korea, and I like Pentax a lot. I have a whole collection of Pentax lenses. I have some videos about that. But when I first met my wife, I was a photographer, and at the time, I was just a very casual shooter, and I remember she had the Pentax K01, and she had a Takuma lens. I don't remember which focal length exactly, but I remember being very intrigued just by the name Takuma. Like, wow, that's a really cool name. So I started looking into it, and that's how I started learning more about Pentax. And I got my first Pentax SLR, the K1000. Over the years, I started buying more and more Takuma lenses, some M42s, some K-mounts, got some Pentax bodies like the Q, a couple more SLRs, the LX, the ME Super, and I just one day decided I had too many bodies, too many lenses, it's time to declutter, so I sold many of them off. I kept the lenses, and I kept the K1000. And anyways, that's kind of my world when it comes to Pentax. I'm really intrigued by camera histories and anything related to photography. So today I want to talk to you about the rise and fall of the Pentaxian Empire. Now, it's a lot. It's a lot of history. It's a lot of dates. It's a lot of names. It's a lot of information. So if I get some things wrong, uh, please don't crucify me, all right? The last thing I need is for the Pentax forums to come after me for screwing up some letter in the Pentax names of the cameras or something. Just a disclaimer, I can't talk about every single camera because it's a lot of cameras and a lot of lenses, so I'm just going to talk about the ones I remember and like some that I think are like a big deal. Anyways, the year is 1919. It's November, we're in Tokyo, and we have Mr. Kumao Kajiwara. He's from a family of 5 brothers. They're all like artists, painters, very artsy people. You've probably heard of his brother, Takuma Kajiwara. He's a famous American photographer. Actually, he's not American at all. He grew up in Japan, but he moved to America, and he became a very famous portrait photographer. Like he was even friends with George Eastman of Kodak, and he'd take like celebrity portraits. He did like photography clubs in Japan, I believe. And anyways, very artsy family. They obviously had the funds, and Mr. Kumao had a passion for photography, I assume, because nobody jumps into the photography business if they're not interested, right? And so he founded the Asahi Optical Company. Of course, it was just called like Asahi back then. Asahi, not Asahi, Asahi. Asahi means sun, morning sunlight, morning sunlight. Anyways, they founded this company in Toshima, which is one of the suburbs in Tokyo, Japan. And it initially started by producing spectacles or lenses. There's actually a picture floating around online. The first thing they ever produced in the factory was it's like a metal barrel with like just a piece of glass, and on the metal barrel it says Takuma, I guess based on his brother, right, who was actually a photographer. Just a quick note, later on we're going to talk about the Takuma lenses, Super Takuma. I prefer to call him Takuma because those lenses were based on his brother, and the Japanese way of saying his name is Takuma. But I guess they just sounds more Western when you say Takuma with the R, right? So just a little note in there. It's also interesting to note that this company, though it was founded in 1919, it didn't actually produce its first camera till like 32 later, like after World War II and all that stuff. So I just think that's like a very interesting piece of trivia. Anyways, I'm not very good with like the actual dates, so I'm just gonna say later in the 20s, they started producing cine lenses, like not cine lenses as you know them today, the kind of lenses for cine projectors. And eventually, they started working with Mota, which is like a precursor to Minolta, and they started making lenses for like one of those folding cameras. It's called the Arcadia. Now, later in this kind of history lesson, we're going to talk a lot about different, I want to say co-ops, because many different Japanese companies or like Korean companies, like just Asian companies in general, they do a lot of collaborations with each other. So much that there's even been cases where people accuse Pentax of just rebranding Tokina lenses as Pentax or Tokina rebranding Pentax lenses as their own. And the truth of the matter is that these companies are all very close knit, like a community, and they all ask each other like, hey, we need these parts, can you produce them? Or hey, we need help producing this or this glass or whatever. So this whole camera history stuff gets really convoluted with all these different camera companies helping each other and producing lenses for each other and outsourcing work. So I just wanted to like put that out there, you know, for people to understand. We're now in the 30s, and they get another gig collabing with Kono Shiroku, which you might know as Konica. And at the time, they're producing like single lenses and astigmatic lenses for the Pearl and Perlit cameras. So time's progressing, they're getting kind of better and better at optics. Eventually, the Japanese government is going to take notice of this. So, the year's 1937. Here is where Imperial Japan starts to take over the neighboring countries, right? We start with the rape of Nanjing, right, China. It was like or also the Nanjing massacre. Like there's different names for it, but so the Japanese government seized control of many different companies, electronics, optics, pretty much every factory in Tokyo and in Japan. They forced Asahi to create optical elements, right? Surveying tools. I think I heard that Asahi was more focused for creating things for the Japanese Imperial Air Force, and Nikon had to produce more things for like the Navy, like periscopes. I talked about the Japanese submarine story in my Top Gun video. Oh, and of course, Top Gun also had to produce things for the Japanese Imperial Army. I guess when you're born with a free spirit of an artist and you don't want to be creating weapons of war or even tools to help it, so Mr. Kumao decided to create a second company, like a spin-off, Asahi Optical Company in 1938, I believe. And well, you can guess what happened. The Japanese government also took that company and kind of forced them to do the same things. Fast forward, and we're now near the end of World War II. Japan got kind of greedy, joined the Axis powers. They made a mistake when they bombed us, and then we returned the favor by bombing them to smithereens, right? We had these Tokyo bombing runs, and unfortunately, one of the bombs fell on the Asahi Optical factory, killing, I'm going to say, like the majority of the workers there, destroying lots of materials and the machines needed for creating glass. We also lost a ton of documents and like history related to Asahi Optical. These were documents from the Taisho era and the wartime Showa era, basically talking about the dealings of the company, prototypes, and pretty much imagine all the technology they amassed during this time just destroyed in one bombing, right? And also all the precision instruments destroyed, all of your workers or most of the workers dead. So it was a pretty grim time for Asahi. during the World War II. After the war, the American forces occupied Japan, and Japanese companies couldn't, I don't want to say they couldn't really exist. They had to get permission from the government to start producing things. And Pentax was one of the lucky ones that they got permission to produce products. But Japanese companies could not produce products for use locally. They could only produce products for exporting, you know, which is good because that brings money, much needed money, to rebuild the country. So it's interesting to note that during this time, there's actually quite a few lenses out there that actually say made in occupied Japan. And I just think that's pretty cool. Like, I don't have one myself. I am somewhat of a collector and I'm trying to tone down the gas, but I think if you have one of those made in occupied Japan, please let me know because that's like super cool. Anyways, that's just something else camera people think is cool, but back to the history lesson. During this time, parts were scarce and machinery was not available. All the Japanese camera companies had to rely on each other and build parts for each other, kind of help each other get back on their feet. And Pentax too started building for all these other different companies, particularly Chiyoda Kohaku, which is, okay, you had Mota, you have Chiyoda. Now, later on in the future, you're going to have Minolta, right? So this evolution of that company, we can make a video about that later. And Konoshiroku Kohaku, which, as you already know, is Konica. They also started making binoculars, and not to be confused with the Russian set of lenses, but these were also called the Jupiter binoculars. I'm sure you can find these pictures online. I wish I could post them, but I don't want to get like a copyright strike from YouTube because YouTube's really in it for the copyright strikes these days. Since it was so hard to come across parts and most of the workers were like killed or dead and they really didn't have too much machinery, but they had a quota to meet for, I'm just going to call them Konica and Minolta because they're not Konica and Minolta yet, but like it's just easier to say them. So they had a quota to meet for these companies, right? And they didn't have the labor or the machinery. So what they did, they created lens elements for the micro cameras, and they would polish them and they would coat them during the daytime in their newish Asahi factory. But since they had to work on the double, they would take the lenses to the president's house at night, where they would use balsam to glue the elements together. And the president at the time was Saburo Matsumoto. Cool guy. Thanks for bringing Pentax back from the ashes, right? Let's jump to around the 1950s. Now, at the time, pretty much Japanese companies, Russian companies, every company imaginable was copying Leica and like Contax cameras, right? Rangefinders was a thing, and Mr. Matsumoto didn't actually like that. Like, he wanted to do his own thing, right? He was a visionary, a man ahead of his time, and eventually that time caught up. Good for him. But he wanted to create something different, and he actually wanted to go ahead and make like the first Japanese-made SLR camera. We're gonna get into it later. It's called the Asahi Flex, but I really want to tell you the story of how that came to be. But anyways, instead of just copying the Rolleiflexes and the Leica rangefinders, he wanted to create a new prototype, an SLR camera for Japanese. So he started looking for help. So Matsumoto was the president of Asahi. I think he had a friend called Ryohei Suzuki, which used to work for Konica. Well, the company before Konica was Konoshiroku. Mr. Suzuki used to make lenses for the company, so he was like a optical designer. So he got on board. Mr. Ryohei Suzuki introduced Matsumoto to Nobuyuki Yoshida, which also used to work for then Konica, but he was more of a designer for camera bodies, right? But he's never actually worked as a, he never actually like built an SLR. He'd only really worked with like rangefinders. So he was kind of hesitant to join Asahi Optical. Instead, he just joined the team for building the camera. Like he just, he didn't want to become part of the company yet, but eventually he will. And if I butchered the names or the dates or something, please forgive me, you know. But like I'm really a one show kind of guy, you know. And there's only so much I can remember. Now remember, this was post-war Japan, and they didn't really have a lot of things to work with. Like they couldn't really import stuff, especially from Germany, because like Germany was pretty much closed off because of the occupation, you know. But in 1935, Matsumoto had a camera made in Dresden. I believe it was called the Reflex Corel, 7.5 centimeters, 2.8 lens. Like he knew there were more modern SLR cameras from Japan, like the Kine Exacta or the Contax S, but like unfortunately he couldn't really get a hold of them. So they really only had this one camera to base their designs off of, and it was pretty old design because it was already this camera was from like 1935, and it somehow miraculously survived the war. So you can imagine how dingy and beat up it must have been, right? Let's fast forward to the 50s, and Asahi actually became the first camera company to have a Japanese-made SLR camera. Like I'm not saying they made the first SLR. That's completely wrong. I'm saying they made the first Japanese-made SLR camera. I believe the first prototype SLR camera actually goes to the Russians with the Sport. And Germans also had like the Ihage Kine Exacta. But remember, you can't really get these cameras into Japan. So they kind of had to work with what they had, you know. And against all odds, they managed to make the Asahi Flex. Now, since this was like a first of its kind camera, it said that every part wasn't even manufactured. It was pretty much made by hand. And one of the drawbacks of this camera was that when you took a picture, the blackout from the mirror going up was actually too long. So it was like as long as you kept your finger on the shutter, the lens stayed up. If you were shooting at higher speeds, maybe it wouldn't matter so much. But if you were shooting at lower speeds, the mirror would just go black. The view would just go black, you know. It's like you have to wait until the mirror to go down. And for anyone who shoots SLRs, you know that if it goes black, you can't really see what's going on. So that was like a big problem with that camera. And that wasn't the only problem with the Asahi Flex, because since this was such a new and innovative camera, like at the time everybody was making Leica copies, they were all aboard the rangefinder train, and here comes the SLR and nobody wants to touch it or sell it. And they had a really hard time finding like a distributor for these Asahi Flex cameras. It also had an Asahi Kohaku 5cm 3.5 lens, and it was very similar to the like the Elmers. It was supposed to be like a Tessar design lens, and I've always wanted one of these, but like a lot of these old lenses are like collector items now, so the prices just keep going up. Can't really justify buying them, but if you have one, consider yourself lucky, because you know back then a lot of these lenses were kind of like Leica copies. Since after the war, all of Germany's patents got put out into the world, and that's kind of the reason why Japan, Russia, and all the other companies were making copies of Leica and Contax and Zeiss, because all of these patents were just put out there. And not only the cameras, but also the lenses. Here we have the introduction of the Asahi Kohaku Takuma lenses. And You know them as Takuma. I call them Takuma because those lenses are based on Takuma Kajiwara, which was the brother of the founder. And I did say he was like a very famous photographer, but I believe he left he left the States after the Great Depression. But he was named like one of the top 10 photographers in America at some time. So he's like a very accomplished photographer. So it's no wonder that these lenses were named Takuma as a kind of a homage to like one of the founders, to the founder's brother, right? Anyways, there was this company that finally agreed to sell and distribute Hattori uh, Tokeiten. That's actually you might know it nowadays as a modern Seiko, like the one that makes the watches. And they were able to distribute these cameras. And I might be wrong, but I believe that the Asahi Flex was sold in the States by Sears, and it went under the name Tower. Like I might be wrong on that one. If someone in the comments could correct me, wait, who am I kidding? Like I don't need to say someone to correct me because someone's always gonna find a mistake and try to correct you, right? So, but if I am wrong, please let me know because this is something I would like to know more about. But unfortunately, I can't find that much information online. Not too many people are interested in Pentax, but I am. And you know what? The Asahi Flex did have its own problems. For one, the viewer was too dark. Back then, like the Takuma lenses, the ones that came out back then, actually had like this preset system, very similar to like what the Russians have, because when you look through the finder, it was just too dark. And then combined with the screen lockout, like if the screen turned black when you take the picture, a really low shutter speed. And then also on top of that, I heard that many cameras actually got returned because the flash sync was off. And people said that, okay, here's a rumor, but some people said that they just threw away those old cameras that were returned. But I think that since it was such a scarce time, they just kind of redid those cameras. They just opened them up and fixed them up and sold them again. But I don't actually know. This is just like pure speculation, just a rumor mill. Anyways, that's the first Asahi Flex. There's something else going on during this time that I forgot to mention, but now we're like in the Korean War. There's lots of eyes on Korea, lots of soldiers, lots of journalists trying to cover. And many of them are in Japan, and you have all these companies all around them producing cameras and lenses. So here is where the world starts to, well, I'm not gonna say the world, but this is where like Americans get a hold of like their Japanese goodies, like all these cameras being sold. And you could say business starts to boom here, right? Anyways, with all this attention going on, around 57, Asahi decides that they need like some kind of new name. I don't really know why. Maybe because they want to appeal to the West much more. And at the time, Zeiss Icon, I never really knew how to say that name, but Zeiss East, VEB of Germany, they actually had many names that they had trademarked for like for production. Like one example is Pentacon. They also had Pentacon, Pentaflex, and Pentax. So that's actually where the name Pentax came from. They bought it from Zeiss. People often say either they bought it from Zeiss or it's a combination of like Pentaprism and Contax. The reality is it's both. For example, Pentacon actually comes from Pentagon and Contax. So that's actually how the name came to be, Pentax, and I think that's like a very interesting piece of trivia for anyone who's interested. It's also interesting to note, I think I might be wrong, but East Germany was like the first makers of pentaprisms for SLRs. So that's a little bit more trivia, because like a lot of this camera company history is like very convoluted, but it's also very rich and interesting. And I just wish more photographers were interested in this kind of thing as much as I am, you know. But anyways, back to Japan. Back in Japan, pentaprisms were actually very hard to make. They had to be made by hand. And Matsumoto had a son. It was Toru Matsumoto, which was the son of Subaru. And he actually went to the States to study. He took some courses at MIT. I don't know which courses exactly, but I'm pretty sure it has to be something related to optics. And anyways, when he came back to Japan, he actually invented a way to mass produce these pentaprisms, and that actually helped Asahi basically take off. Like that was one of the things that helped them upscale in production, like being able to make these pentaprisms much cheaply and quickly to keep up with the demand for the cameras they were making. Let's talk about the let's talk about the pre-Spotmatic cameras, because they all kind of contributed a little bit into finally making the Spotmatic that we all know and most of us love, but some of us don't. But anyways, not the S1. I think the S1 actually came after the S3. I'm not really sure on the nomenclature of these names, but I'm going to go ahead and call it the S, and someone can tell me if I'm wrong, because I probably am. But anyways, you got the, I'm going to go ahead and call it the Pentax S, I think, something like that. But this camera was important because when Pentax was able to standardize the shutter speeds on their cameras, you know, because like before, like all the shutter speeds were kind of all over the place. And this was something that the other camera companies actually adopted as well. I could also be wrong on that, but I think that's the importance of this camera, that the shutter speeds were standardized. The S2, the pre-Spotmatic 2, I'm going to call it that, that one actually introduced the little red dot on Pentax cameras, like the film cameras. If you own a film camera from Pentax, you know that whenever you cock the lever and your film is ready to shoot, a little red dot appears. That's to let you know that your camera is cocked. And as for the S3, I think they were able to, I think that was the first time Pentax was able to actually reach a speed of 1/1000th of a second for their shutter speed. And I think that was like the key winning point for that camera. So around this time, you also got the first auto Takuma lenses. I think I explained earlier how before the first Takumars had like a preset aperture system similar to the Russian system, which is actually very hard to explain if you don't have one of these preset aperture ring lenses. It's really hard for me to try and explain the way they work. But now you had the auto Takumars. Like before, if you try to take a picture, you had to focus first, and then you would set your aperture. And yeah, that was kind of a pain. But now you had these like auto Takumars in which you would basically take your picture, and when you took the picture, the aperture closed to where it's supposed to, and it's quite a nice thing. Yeah. Anyways, now we're getting to like the Spotmatic years, and this is where things kind of get a little convoluted for me as well, because it's kind of hard for me to still find information on this. But basically, before the Spotmatic, you had to have like an external light meter, or Pentax actually had like a little light meter that you would place on top of the camera and on top of a little prism. And then came the Spotmatic. Now the Spotmatic, when it was showcased, it was supposed to use spot metering. That's where the name Spotmatic came from. But actually, when it was released, it had a way down metering. But when the Spotmatic was actually released, it had average stop-down metering. And I would like to go into the different kinds of meterings, but I think I'll leave that for another video. But here's like a very interesting story because, okay, Pentax was the first company to invent through the lens metering, right? Because, you know, I just previously said how before you needed to have an external kind of metering, like external light meter or on the camera. But this was the first time where a camera could actually use light metering in the camera. Pentax invented it and they, I guess you can say they showcased it. But the first camera company to actually release a camera with through the lens metering was Topcon, because there was okay, this gets confusing, right? So Pentax invented through the lens metering with their prototype, but then Topcon releases their camera first, so they get the world's first through the lens metering, even though Pentax invented it, and then Pentax releases the Spotmatic, right? So I think that was not cool, even though I like Topcon, you know. And it's also interesting to note because here's another little story you might not know, but the Spotmatic originally was meant to use spot metering. Maybe I should make that video on the meterings. Okay, so spot metering is your light meter points at some point in your frame. Like for example, you have a shirt. But the problem was Pentax thought that people, should I say this nicely or not? I think Pentax thought people were too stupid to figure out spot metering, or it was not easy enough for people. For example, if you pointed it at like someone's white shirt, the picture would come out too dark because the camera was trying to make up for that white shirt. So they changed it to stop down metering, and later in the future they did center weight metering. But I thought that was a very interesting story, and even though they changed it from spot metering to stop down metering, the name Spotmatic still stuck because, you know, I guess it was just really catchy for them, you know, Spotmatic. And now we're in the 60s, right? And they have the Spotmatic. They also had a slogan. The slogan went something like, "Just hold a Pentax." Because I guess they thought if you held a Pentax in your hands, you were just going to know how awesome and high quality these cameras were. So that was like their whole marketing right there. Like they really wanted to market Pentax as kind of a easy to use camera, right? And that's actually kind of the beginning of their downfall. But we're gonna get that in the second video. I think we can end it here with the Spotmatic. If I make some mistakes, I'm sure you're going to let me know. Just remember, I'm just one guy, and everything I do because I love, and I especially love Pentax cameras, and especially the Super Takuma lenses. And I can't wait until we start talking about things like SMC coatings, the whole Ricoh Hoya fiascos, and yeah, you know, Pentax is still around, even if it got taken out of the Ricoh name. So yeah, let me know how I did. Sorry for butchering the names, and there's a part 2 coming, so don't start complaining yet until you see that. Anyways, I'll see you around.